So Mark Rowley, the head of the Metropolitan Police, has weighed into this controversy over the arrest of the comedian Graham Linehan at Heathrow. Linehan was returning from a trip to Arizona. Um, so I'm going to read this out from the Independent. I'll just get straight into it. And there's also a link to another article in the Independent. Let's get some water first. I've a bit of a mouth ulcer here. Apparently Farage has been speaking to a forum in Washington DC about free speech and claiming that Britain's a totalitarian state. I mean, I have a big problem with the leader of a British political party going to another country to sort of stoke up domestic divisions here, or moan about how awful Britain is, particularly in the United States. It's one of many reasons I do not trust reform. Because Donald Trump, for all the talk that MAGA Republicans come out with regarding free speech, let's not forget that Trump's heads an administration that is very hostile to critical press and would dearly love to have control of CNN and other networks. I believe Elon Musk actually proposed that, although it never happened, and I don't think it will in the United States. But I really have a big problem with the current American administration thinking they can lecture us on anything, actually. Okay, we'll just read this out. The report's by Brian E. Gooch and it's from the 3rd of September. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley has backed officers as the force faces criticism over the arrest of comedy writer Graham Linehan, but has said the force should not be responsible for policing toxic culture war debates. Sir Mark said his officers are in an impossible position as he called for the law to be changed and said the force will now only take action on social media abuse where there is clear risk of harm or disorder, as he broke his silence over the arrest of Father Ted Writer over anti-trans posts on social media. I'll go read that again because it's impossible. It's important, excuse me. The force will now only take action on social media abuse where there is a clear risk of harm or disorder. That would be, I assume, if there's an imminent threat of a riot breaking out. I think other forces should follow suit. Linehan claimed on his blog that he was arrested by 5 armed police officers when he arrived at Heathrow Airport on Monday from Arizona over 3 tweets on the platform X. He has said he was arrested like a terrorist. He has since said he plans to sue the Met following his arrest over 3 social media posts for wrongful arrest and breach of his human rights. Supported by the Free Speech Union founded by Sir Toby Young, Linehan said, according to the Times, this was a horrible glimpse of the dystopian clown show that Britain has become. The FSU will support me by providing lawyers to advise on a claim against the Met Police for wrongful arrest and wrongful imprisonment in the hope that no one else is treated like a terrorist for speaking their mind on social media. Both Sir Keir Starmer and Health Secretary Wes Streeting have responded to the arrest, with the latter saying the Met should focus on policing streets, not just policing tweets. Streeting, incidentally, is one of the ministers who hasn't been affected by yesterday's reshuffle. At Prime Minister's questions, Sir Keir reiterated that the force should focus on the most serious issues such as antisocial behaviour, knife crime and violence. And when she was Home Secretary, Cooper also stressed that point. Sir Mark said in a statement, on Monday officers arrested a man in his 50s at Heathrow in relation to allegations of inciting violence linked to posts on X. The officers involved in the arrest had reasonable grounds to believe an offence had been committed under the Public Order Act. While the decision to investigate and ultimately arrest the man was made within existing legislation, which dictates that a threat to punch someone from a protected group could be an offence, I understand the concern caused by such incidents, given different perspectives on the balance between free speech and the risks of inciting violence in the real world. One of the tweets that Linehan claims he was arrested over called on people to call the cops on trans-identifying people and if all else fails, punch him in the balls. Another read in response to a photo of a crowd of people holding a transgender and LGBT plus pride flags. I hate them. Misogynists and homophobes. Fuck them. That's a direct quote. Linehan, whose other shows include The It Crowd and Black Books, claimed that this was a serious point made with a joke. He wrote in his blog that his single bail conditions is that he is not to go on X and he faces a further interview in October. Sir Mark continued, most reasonable people would agree that genuine threats of physical violence against an identified person or group should be acted upon by officers. Such actions can and do have serious and violent real-world implications. But when it comes to lesser cases where there is ambiguity in terms of intent and harm, policing has been left between a rock and a hard place by successive governments who have given officers no choice but to record such incidents as crimes when they're reported. Then they are obliged to follow all lines of inquiry and take action as appropriate. I don't believe we should be policing toxic culture war debates, and officers are currently in an impossible position. He continued, adding he has offered to provide suggestions to the Home Office on where the law and policy should be qualified. It comes as Mr. Streeton suggested that the government might look at changes to legislation following criticism of the police response to the incident. He told Times Radio it's very easy for people to criticise the police. The police enforce the laws of the land that we as legislators provide, adding, so if we're not getting the balance right, then that's something we'll all have to look at and consider. While Downing Street declined to comment directly on the arrest, saying it was an operational matter for the police, it said that the Prime Minister had made his priorities for policing clear. Sir Keir's official spokesperson said the Prime Minister and Home Secretary, this will be the last Home Secretary, remember she changed yesterday, so Yvette Cooper, have been clear where their priorities for crime and policing are, and that's tackling antisocial behaviour, shoplifting, street crime, as well as reducing serious violent crimes like knife crime and violence against women. So Mark explained that a change to legislation would offer greater clarity and common sense, which would enable us to limit the resources we dedicate to tackling online statements to those cases creating real threats in the real world. If agreed, we could be ready to test new approaches quickly within a matter of weeks. Linehan already faces trial at Westminster Magistrates Court on Thursday over two separate charges. One is in relation to harassing transgender activist Sophia Brooks on social media, and the other is for damaging Miss Brooks' mobile phone in October. He denied the charges at a hearing on the 12th of May. Linehan has become increasingly known in recent years for sharing anti-trans rhetoric online that has attracted significant criticism from LGBT plus groups. In 2020, his Twitter account was permanently banned for repeated violations of the rules against hateful conduct and platform manipulation. This was before the Musk takeover. So, there's a link there, incidentally, about, on that point about the law being changed. Starmer tells police to prioritise serious crimes after Graham Linehan arrested over social media posts. Apparently, Linehan's blood pressure was also high and he was taken to hospital. On the point about armed officers, there is one thing about that needs to be pointed out. This wasn't like armed officers arriving at his house. At Heathrow, officers are always armed, and apparently their weapons weren't actually drawn, so that needs to be put into context. It's not like they sort of rushed on him with drawn firearms. There's a lot to break down with this. I have long felt that the police haven't got the priorities right. I've long felt that they have prioritised this when they really shouldn't be. Now, it is true that they are not the ones that set the legislation. They are acting on the legislation that is there. So that's up to politicians to change the legislation. Apparently, Rowley said he's going to be offering advice to the Home Office on this. What form could that take? Perhaps greater clarity on the ambiguity issue. That is to say, if someone is just making a flippant comment about violence, that shouldn't be seen in the same light as imminently provoking violence. But there is a point to this that doesn't sit very well with me, and I appreciate not everyone will agree here. I do take a bit of issue with the Free Speech Union because their position seems to be it's absolutist. You could say whatever you want. I don't agree with that. Frankly, one of those tweets is advocating violence. You know, he is literally saying, if all else fails, punch them on the balls. Now, if you're a comedian and you say, you can hide behind, oh, I'm making a joke for anything. But this isn't, Linehan has serious views on this. So I don't think he can really say he was just making a joke. I don't really buy that. Because this is his views. He's anti-trans and that's fine, that's his opinion. But if all else fails, punch them on the balls. Now that's, you know, there's no real ambiguity there. He's calling for violence. But does that mean he's calling for imminent violence? Not necessarily. I do think that the police have often got this wrong. I think that the fact that, for example, uniformed officers, I keep quoting this case because I think it's important, in Hertfordshire went round to someone's house. Now, you cannot tell me that that was a police priority that day. In the whole county of Hertfordshire, with over 1 million people, you cannot tell me that their priority was to go to a couple's house over some tweets in which they'd fallen out with their daughter's school. I suspect in the whole county of Hertfordshire there'll be a lot more serious offences than that. There'll be sexual offences, there'll be burglary, there'll be violent assault. The chief police officer in Hertfordshire later admitted it was bad optics. So I don't really buy this argument the police are making that their hands are tied. There is a decision to prioritise certain offences. And I accept that the police need to act when legislation is there. I mean, they can't just do nothing when it is the legislation. For instance, if someone reports to the police that they feel they've been a victim of a hate crime, the police can't do nothing. But I think the problem is, more often than not, they've went in and not seen both sides of the story. More often than not, they've went in and just assumed guilt. In the case of Linehan, like I say, he's went to the Free Speech Union, and like Lucy Connolly, he's going to be held up as a martyr of free speech. But there is a side to this, which is, I think the police have been overzealous. I'm putting that on record. I do think there are threats to free speech in this country. And one thing that deserves a lot more scrutiny is Labour's attempts to legally have a definition for Islamophobia. I think that needs to be dropped drastically, because that would be a sinister way to shut down criticism of religion. Islamist extremism deserves all the criticism it gets. So any attempts to make it legal to be, what is Islamophobia? Who gets to define that? Islamists? Oversensitive Muslims? Who gets to define it? To me, that would be a very dangerous thing, and it would be blasphemy laws by the back door. But I do have a bit of an issue with the Free Speech Union. I think that Toby Young, who's a conservative, so there's a partisan agenda there. I think there is absolutely this idea that free speech means you could say absolutely anything you want. Absolutely anything, including advocating violence. I happen to agree with the Prime Minister that it's not okay to advocate violence, no matter how strongly you feel about something. And, people will say Linehan was just joking. Maybe he was, but I still think it's overreach. I still think him being held in a cell and the way that was handled was far from ideal. The police say that when he had a medical issue, he was brought to hospital. But, there is also something in this. People should be more responsible with their own words. We live in an era where there is legitimate concerns about civil liberties, but I also think too many people won't take responsibility for their own words and actions. And, I also have views on the trans issue. I do think some trans activists are very misogynistic. And some of them have been guilty of harassing women over their views on this issue. But I think a responsible adult, I don't care who you are or what your views are, has to take some responsibility over their own words. Now, Linehan isn't. He's basically, it was all a joke, it didn't mean anything. And he says he was trying to make a serious point. If you're trying to make a serious point, then don't talk about punching someone. That should be an obvious thing, I think. I appreciate not everyone's going to agree with me on that. There'll be people watching this video thinking that I'm defending the police. I'm not. I'm just saying that people should also be responsible for their own words. And it's a little bit of a cop-out to say, I can say whatever I want. If anything happens, then, free speech is gone in this country. There have definitely been cases where I don't think there should have been any police involvement. I would cite the example of, or at least there should have been a common sense applied that wasn't applied. The street preacher, it was either Rotherham or Rochdale not long ago, who he was arrested because he'd asked a Muslim woman about her thoughts on domestic violence in the Quran. An hour later, the police approached him and accused him of committing a non-crime hate incident. But the problem there was they played judge, jury and executioner without trying to establish his point of view. This also happened in the Brendan Kavanagh incident in St Pancras. Now, in that incident, he wasn't arrested, but you had a a police officer from the British Transport Police, and she basically went in quite aggressively and said to Brendan Kavanagh, "You can't say that," because he told a nationalistic Chinese student, this is Britain, not China, making the point that you can't tell people in a public area what they can or cannot do. Um, Again, I think the police handled that badly. So the argument that Rowley's making that the police are in an impossible position, it's a little bit like the argument made for judges, that their hands are tied. I do think it's an ideological decision or an operational decision that police officers prioritise these things. I mean, they have to accept that. I'd like Rowley to address the fact, for instance, that London has, like the rest of the country, has a serious problem with theft. Now, how does he justify to the public that someone's being arrested over a foolish tweet or free, and yet, you're getting a situation where people don't feel the police are doing anywhere near enough on shop theft? Rowley has to answer to that, so do other police chiefs. Because we have a situation whereby if goods are under £200, the police just don't bother doing anything. And yet someone who makes a stupid post online will almost be guaranteed to have a police follow-up. So there is something very wrong with that. But my only caveat with all of this is I do think the right are putting out this narrative that you can say whatever you want, and it is predominantly the right. I don't entirely trust the Free Speech Union because I don't agree with Toby Young's absolutism. I don't agree that inciting violence is harmless. That's what he seems to think. It's not. It really isn't. If you've ever been on the receiving end of verbal abuse or threats, then you'll know that words are not harmless. They're not. But there is that ambiguity thing. Someone saying something because they're making an angry rant isn't the same as explicitly threatening violence. But, individuals also have to be more responsible. Linehan can say that was a joke, and maybe it was, but, if all else fails, punch them in the balls. I can understand why a trans person would be offended by that. I can understand why someone would see that as a threat. And so whilst I think his arrest was probably overzealous, he said it. And the other cases, if he broke someone's phone, he did deny the charges. That indicates he's a bit of a loose cannon. So I don't know. The other issue with all of this is that you get MAGA types like Vance and Bannon and others swooping in and saying that free speech is dead in this country. I stopped following someone I had previously respected, Melissa Chen, Singapore-born journalist now active in the US and the UK. And I followed her for a while. I thought she was a voice of common sense. But a bit like Majid Nawaz, to me, she kind of went off in a different direction. I'm not saying she's full MAGA, but she definitely started acting as an apologist for MAGA, and I have a big problem with that. I think the icing on the cake for me was when she endorsed a post saying that free speech is completely dead in Britain and that we're now in an authoritarian state. I think that sort of hyperbole doesn't help anyone. We have problems in this country, but I don't think hyperbole helps. It just doesn't, because it isn't accurate. It's not quite as bad as Bannon saying we're on the cusp of civil war, but anyway, that's my take. I just think that there is a problem with the police getting the wrong priorities. Even if it is legislation, they are still making the operational choice to prioritise these things. I would like to see changes in the Home Office in that regard. It should be a bit more explicit that it should be an imminent threat. However, the right need to be challenged on their attitude that inciting violence is perfectly fine. It isn't fine. It isn't. And I'm seeing a situation where people who spout out reckless things are not really, they're not taking any responsibility for it. I've got very strong views on our justice system, but I could never reasonably advocate violence against judges, for example. I advocate pressure against judges. I advocate criticism of judges. I advocate peaceful pressure on the system, an intense peaceful pressure, because I think it's very, very flawed. but I would never advocate violence, and if I did, I couldn't complain about, coming under scrutiny for that. No matter how strongly you feel, you can't advocate violence unless the one caveat might be if it's self-defense. But there is an attitude from the right these days that, we see these things happen. Someone makes a post that can be seen as insightful or not, but regardless, they then face police action. But there's always this attitude of victimhood without any personal accountability. So Linehan's doing it now. I'm a complete victim. I'm a free speech martyr. But he did say, if all else fails, punch them on the balls. Now that's, if you're a trans person, you might well construe that as a threat to violence. How's that any different from a trans activist saying hang turfs? Again, they would say it's just a protest, but that is incitement against women who are wary of the trans movement. In both cases, I say it's not okay. And comedians do have this tendency to hide behind comedy when they're being obnoxious. Just because you're a comedian doesn't give you a green light to incite violence. So I've mixed views on the whole thing, but definitely something needs to change in terms of how we go forward. What I don't want to see, I want to see less police time spent on this, but what I don't want to see is a situation where threats are completely ignored. Because we've seen situations where they have been ignored and then that threat is actually carried out. And then what would happen? The police would be criticised for not acting on it. So in that sense, Rowley has a point about the police being actually it was Wes Streeting said the police are in a very difficult position. He has a point with that, because if the police do nothing, let's just use a scenario here. Let's say Linehan made that tweet and there was some example of one of the trans people he's been in argument with actually being physically attacked. Then people would say, why did the police not act on his incitement? That's what they would say. So, in summary, I don't think the police should prioritise this stuff, and I do think there should be changes to the law to make it more explicitly, in terms of threats. But I don't agree with the right. I don't agree with the Free Speech Union that people can say absolutely anything they want, including threats of violence. I don't think it's harmless. And I would challenge Toby Young, Sir Toby Young. How would he respond if he was on the receiving end of a rampaging mob? Would he be claiming, oh well, it's just words? If that mob was incited by by disinformation or something, would he honestly say it's just words? So I do have a bit of a problem with the way the right seem to think that words are harmless. They're not harmless when they can be used to stoke up sentiments, incite violence. That is not harmless. And that's something that's being lost in this debate. As for American involvement, Vance and Co can go and fuck off, because they are part of an administration that is absolutely rotten to the core and has violated American civil liberties. We've seen American citizens threatened with deportation. We've seen people who, having false charges against them, being accused of being gang members when they're not, etc. The Trump administration and its members have absolutely no right to be pointing fingers at Europe over liberty. No right whatsoever. This is an administration that pardoned violent insurrectionists. We shouldn't take any lectures from them. And another point, and I'll close with this, all of this directed at Keir Starmer and the Labour government. This was going on under the Tories' watch, so why was the right not up in arms at that time, at least not to the same extent? Yeah, makes you wonder.